My father, John Marston. This story wouldn't be complete without telling who he was and what he did. He was once a bad man, but he did everything he could to be better. He grew up in Dutch van der Linde's gang, lived by their rules. He robbed, he killed, he did whatever it took to survive, but then he decided to leave that life behind. He wanted a fresh start with my mother Abigail to build a better world for me, but the past doesn't let go so easily. I was just a kid back then, but I remember everything. The men gathered around the campfire, cleaning their guns, talking about the old days, the sound of horseshoes on the dirt. Back then, the gang was my family. Uncle, Hosea, Sadie, Charles, and Arthur Morgan. Arthur, he was one of the most honest men I've ever known. He taught me how to fish, how to be a good man. He was tough, didn't talk much, but he always looked out for me and my mother. He was like an older brother to me. He and my father didn't always see eye to eye, but deep down, they wanted the same thing, a way out of this madness.
Thank you, brother. I want you to not look back. Like I said.
But things in the gang weren't right. Dutch used to be a man who gave people hope, but over time, greed, ambition, and paranoia consumed him. At first, I didn't understand, but Arthur saw it all. He was the first to realize that the gang was rotting from the inside. One by one, everyone around us disappeared. Hosea died. Lenny died. The loyal men either vanished or found themselves in a war they couldn't win. And in the end, Arthur accepted that it was all over. I don't remember Arthur's last moments, but I know from my father what I've heard. He gave everything to save my father. He had already accepted his fate because he knew that in this life, there were only two endings, death or betrayal. And Dutch had become the man behind that betrayal. My father, my mother, and I got out of there, but we couldn't leave our past behind. The government pulled him back into their dirty work. Some of his old gang members were still out there, and the state wanted him to finish the job. They had leverage. Us, his family. My father had no choice but to face his bloody past. He hunted down Bill Williamson, Javier Escuela, and finally, Dutch van der Linde. He tracked down and took down the men he once called brothers. He did it to buy our freedom, and when it was over, he was free. Or at least, that's what we thought. We returned to our ranch, trying to go back to the way things were. He cared for the land, the animals, my mother, and me. But deep down, he knew, we all knew, there was no such thing as true peace. And then, that day came. One morning, shadows appeared on the dusty road leading to our farm, then another and another, until there were dozens of soldiers, Pinkerton agents, government men. They were never going to let him go. To them, he was just a pawn. And when pawns outlive their usefulness, they get discarded. My father understood that. He sent my mother and me away, looked into my eyes one last time. Then he took his gun and opened the door. Beyond that door, there was only death, and my father faced it alone. The gunfire echoed. Dust and blood filled the air, and he fell. He gave his life just to buy us a little more time. But time doesn't heal everything. A few years later, I lost my mother too. Just like my father, she was gone. And me? I spent years thinking, would revenge change anything? Would it ease my anger? But then I asked myself, what would my father do? And you know what? He wouldn't have let that man's death go unanswered. Edgar Ross, the man who killed my father, the government's pawn. I found him in Mexico, retired, fishing, living as if nothing had ever happened. But everything had happened. I spoke to him. Then, I challenged him, just like my father once did. But this time the outcome was different. My hand didn't shake. I raised my gun, pulled the trigger, and Ross's body fell into the water. Did it bring me peace? Number my father is still gone. My mother too. Arthur, Hosea, Lenny, they're all just memories now. Revenge doesn't bring back the people you've lost. But sometimes, a man has to do what needs to be done. And I, Jack Marston, am that man now.